How does a country as vast and diverse as India actually plan its entire financial year? I mean, it's not just about crunching numbers, is it?
No, not at all. It's this huge, comprehensive roadmap, a really delicate balancing act, income, expenditure, and this whole national vision for millions and millions of people.
It really is. And for anyone looking to understand the mechanics of a major global economy, this is, well, it's a truly fascinating deep dive.
It absolutely is.
Sure.
I mean, this one document shapes everything from massive infrastructure projects down to, really granular social welfare schemes. It directly influences daily life for pretty much every citizen.
So understanding it gives you this profound insight into the nation's priorities, maybe its challenges too.
Exactly. What it values, where the difficulties lie.
Okay. So today, we're taking that deep dive into the Union Budget of India. Our mission really is to unpack its constitutional roots, understand its core components,
Trace its journey, from concept right through to parliamentary approval.
explore the powerful oversight mechanisms in place, because that's crucial,
Super important.
and demystify some of those key financial terms that shape the whole narrative.
Yeah, makes sense of the jargon.
And we'll be drawing from authoritative sources, the Indian Constitution itself, detailed parliamentary research, insights from financial experts to give you a really well-informed perspective.
Sounds good.
So let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, you have to start right at the bedrock, the Indian Constitution. And here's something interesting. Many might assume the term budget is explicitly defined there, but actually it's not.
Really? So what does it say?
Instead, Article 1 and 12 mandates what's officially called the Annual Financial Statement, or AFS.
Okay, AFS, Annual Financial Statement, not budget in strict constitutional terms. So who's formally responsible for presenting something so critical? Is it the finance minister?
Formally, Article 112 says the President of India is responsible for causing this statement, this estimate of receipts and expenditures, to be laid before both houses of Parliament, the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, for each financial year.
The president. So it's a fundamental constitutional requirement, placing it right at the highest level of executive accountability.
That's the idea.
But, in practice, we all see the finance minister standing up in Parliament delivering that iconic budget speech every year. It's a huge public event, always filled with anticipation.
Exactly. That happens in practice. But this formal role of the president, it really underscores the AFS's crucial importance for, fiscal responsibility and transparency. It serves as this vital roadmap for the government's financial policy.
And you mentioned something interesting about the drafting.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that during the drafting of the Constitution, there were actually proposals to let the finance minister present it directly, or even give sort of more primacy to the Lok Sabha on financial matters.
Uh-huh.
And there was even a proposal to charge ministers' salaries to the Consolidated Fund. But all these amendments were ultimately rejected.
So that was a deliberate design choice then.
It seems so. It highlights this clear intent to position the budget as a national statement endorsed by the symbolic head of state, rather than, say, just another ministerial proposal.
That's a great historical nugget. It really clarifies the thinking behind the process. Okay, so once it's presented, how is this massive financial statement actually structured? We often hear about revenue and capital in finance context, but what do those terms really mean when we're talking about a national budget?
Right. So the union budget is fundamentally divided into two key parts: the revenue budget and the capital budget. Let's break them down.
Okay.
The revenue budget basically details the government's expected revenue, its income, and its spending on its daily operations and administration. Now, crucially, this expenditure does not lead to the creation of assets.
Okay, so think of it like paying your monthly household bills.
That's a good analogy.
So, like salaries for government employees, office running costs, maybe interest on loans, things that keep the lights on and the system running day to day, but don't really build new infrastructure or create long-term value. Is that fair?
That's an excellent way to put it, yes. And within that revenue side, you have revenue receipts. These are the government's earnings that don't create liabilities or reduce assets.
Where does most of that come from?
The largest component, unsurprisingly, is tax revenue. This includes direct taxes, like income tax, securities transaction tax, and indirect taxes, like the goods and services tax, GST, and excise duty.
Right.
Historically, taxes like GST, corporation tax, and income tax, they form the bedrock of the government's own revenue, often, contributing well over 60% of its own receipts.
Okay, so taxes are the big one, and then there's non-tax revenue. What typically falls into that category?
Yeah, those are earnings from other sources. Things like interest receipts from loans the government has given out, dividends from state-owned companies it owns shares in, profits from public enterprises, various fees, other charges.
Got it.
These usually make up a smaller, but still pretty significant portion of the government's own receipts. And then on the other side of the revenue budget, you have revenue expenditure.
Which is the spending part.
Right. The actual spending on general government functioning, salaries, those interest payments on debt we mentioned, and subsidies. And interestingly, the old distinction between plan and non-plan expenditure.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Tied to the 5-year plans.
Exactly. That was actually removed back in the 2017-18 budget, so it's a bit simpler now.
Okay, that clarifies the sort of day-to-day operational side. But what about the future? How does India fund its long-term growth, build new assets, big projects? That's where the capital budget comes in, I assume.
Exactly. The capital budget records the government's assets and liabilities. So its capital receipts are those receipts that either create liabilities for the government or reduce its assets.
Okay, create liabilities.
Yep.
Like borrowing.
Precisely. This includes government borrowings, market loans, treasury bills, that sort of thing. It also includes loan recoveries, money it gets back from loans it gave out earlier, and significantly, the sale of assets through disinvestment.
Ah, like selling shares in public sector companies.
Exactly. Those kinds of receipts are vital for funding the large-scale investments. In some years, these capital receipts, especially borrowings and disinvestment, make up a huge chunk, maybe close to 90% of all capital receipts.
So that's how they get the money for the big, potentially transformative projects. And the spending side of the capital budget, what's that called?
That's capital expenditure. And this is the spending that does result in creating assets or reducing liabilities.
Okay, example.
Things like purchasing land, buying equipment, machinery, investing in shares, or providing loans and advances to state governments or those public sector undertakings, the PSUs.
So using your analogy, if revenue expenditure is like paying the monthly bills,
Yeah.
then capital expenditure is more like making a down payment on a new house, or maybe investing in solar panels for your roof for long-term benefit, something that builds value.
That's a great way to think about it, absolutely. And you'll see that many sectors, like, say, defense or education, can actually have both components. Well, building a new school building, that's capital expenditure, creating an asset. But paying the teacher's salaries for that school every month, that's revenue expenditure.
Ah, okay, that makes perfect sense. So understanding those two distinct budgets really helps clarify what the government spends on. But the crucial question remains, how does it actually get all this money to fund both its daily operations and its long-term investments?
Right. Broadly, it's primarily through its own receipts. So taxes, fees, fines, profits from public enterprises, selling assets, and crucially, through borrowings.
Borrowings are a big part, though.
They are. Historically, borrowings are a significant component. You often see them funding, say, a quarter, maybe even more, of the government's total expenditure in a given year.
A significant portion of the money collected by the central government, it also gets distributed down to the states, right? That's a massive part of India's federal structure, the fiscal relations.
Absolutely huge. The central government collects certain key taxes like income tax, corporation tax, central GST, and then it shares a portion of this money with the states.
And how is that share decided?
It's based on recommendations from an independent body called the Finance Commission. For example, the 14th Finance Commission recommended that a substantial chunk, 42%, of central tax receipts should be given to the states.
42%, that's a lot.
It is, but, and this is an important point, certain components like cess and surcharges, which are typically additional levies tacked onto taxes for specific purposes like maybe education or infrastructure, those are not shared with the states. And that can be a point of contention sometimes between the center and the states.
Ah, that's a key distinction to understand. Okay, so once all this money comes in and gets allocated, where does it ultimately go? What are the biggest spending categories that really, eat into the budget year after year?
Well, a huge chunk, often around a quarter of the annual budget, sometimes more, goes towards interest payments on borrowed funds from previous years.
Wow, a quarter just servicing old debt.
Yeah. And this is what's called committed expenditure. It means it has to be paid pretty much regardless of other priorities. And that can significantly constrain any new spending plans.
I can imagine. What else?
Beyond that, major allocations consistently include subsidies, helping support essential goods and services for citizens and pensions for retired government employees. These three categories alone, Interest, subsidies, and pensions often account for nearly half of the government's total spending.
Nearly half gone before you even start thinking about new development projects or investments. That's substantial.
It really shapes the available fiscal space.
So how does this entire colossal plan actually come to life? What's the journey like from, ministry desks piled high with spreadsheets filled with thousands of data points to the floors of Parliament where it actually becomes law?
It's an incredibly precise and detailed process, and it doesn't just happen overnight. It typically begins a full 6 months in advance.
6 months. Wow. So it's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. What are the key stages in that 6-month lead up?
Okay, so it kicks off with consultation. The finance ministry consults very widely with economists, industry bodies, various government ministries, just gathering input, understanding needs, priorities.
Getting a sense of the landscape.
Exactly. Then comes the accumulation and authorization of data. This is where each government department provides its individual estimates of expenditures and revenues for the coming year.
And those are just accepted.
Oh, no. They're rigorously scrutinized by senior officials within the departments, then analyzed by their respective ministries, and then they're finally sent to the finance ministry, which looks at the overall resource allocation.
That sounds like a massive, complex data flow. Lots of back and forth, I imagine.
It is. It's huge. After that, you move into composing. This is the core drafting stage. Here, the budget is meticulously put together, ensuring it aligns with the government's broader policy goals and allocating funds to various ministries and key welfare schemes.
Fitting all the pieces together.
Right. Then, the draft budget needs authorization. It has to get approval from the Union Cabinet before it's ready to be presented.
And then comes the big day, the public presentation by the finance minister in Parliament, with all eyes watching.
Exactly. The speech, the documents tabled, and finally, once the related bills, the appropriation and finance bills are passed by Parliament, we move to execution.
That's when the money can actually start flowing.
Yes, that's when the executive departments can actually collect the revenue as planned and spend the money on the approved schemes. It's a very carefully orchestrated, multi-stage sequence of events.
Okay, so we've seen the budget come to life, conceptually at least. But who ensures it's actually responsible? How does Parliament, as the, voice of the people, step in to scrutinize these massive financial plans before they're executed? This is where the checks and balances become really critical, right?
Absolutely vital. So after the budget is presented, the first step is a general discussion which takes place in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha.
What happens there?
It's a broad examination of the budget proposals, the overall direction. But importantly, no voting occurs at this stage. It's just debate. Then, Parliament typically adjourns for a few weeks. This recess is crucial. It allows 24 specialized standing committees focused on specific subject areas like health, defense, commerce, to scrutinize individual ministries' demands for grants.
Demands for grants. That's the detailed spending breakdown for each ministry.
Exactly. These are the detailed estimates of expenditure for each ministry. So the committees don't just take the budget speech at face value, they really dig deep into these proposed numbers.
How deep do they go?
Pretty deep. These committees examine the amounts allocated to various programs and schemes within a ministry. They review past spending trends, utilization rates, and they hear directly from ministry officials and sometimes outside experts.
So they can really question the officials.
Well, yes. And this deep dive often reveals significant insights. For instance, I remember reading a report where the Standing Committee on Health and Family Welfare, looking at the 2018-19 budget, observed that the central health expenditure was only about 0.3% of GDP.
Which is low compared to targets.
Very low. Far below the government's own target of 2.5% set for 2025. They also noted delays in fund transfers down the chain, which directly impacted crucial health initiatives on the ground. So this kind of scrutiny highlights major gaps between policy goals and actual resource allocation.
That's a really powerful check. What happens once these committees finish their work and submit their reports? Do they then vote on every single demand for grant, line by line?
Well, the Lok Sabha, the lower house, which has primary financial powers, then holds detailed discussions and votes on specific demands for grants, informed by these committee reports. However, there's a fascinating and often quite controversial aspect called the guillotine.
The guillotine sounds dramatic.
It kind of is. It basically means that any demands for grants that haven't been discussed and voted on individually by the last day allocated for this process are all voted on together, en masse, without any specific debate.
Wait, passed without debate. How much gets passed like that?
It varies, but imagine this. In multiple financial years, including as recently as 2018-19. Entire segments of India's budget representing substantial amounts of public spending were effectively approved using the guillotine, passed without any detailed parliamentary debate on those specific demands.
That's incredible. So a significant amount of spending can be approved essentially on the nod.
It highlights this tension, between parliamentary efficiency, getting the budget passed on time, and ensuring thorough scrutiny of every single spending proposal. It's a much debated practice.
I can see why. Does that mean MPs don't have other ways to express disapproval or raise specific concerns about particular spending plans during this voting stage?
No, they absolutely do. They can move what are called cut motions. There are essentially three types. There's a policy cut, which proposes reducing a specific grant to just 1 rupee. That signifies complete disapproval of the underlying policy of that ministry. Then there's an economy cut, which seeks to reduce the grant by a specific amount to argue for more efficient spending, suggesting a saving. And finally, a token cut, which reduces the grant by a symbolic amount, say R is 100, just to express a specific grievance or concern about some aspect of the ministry's working.
And what happens if one of these cut motions actually passes? Does it just reduce the funding?
It's much bigger than that. If a cut motion passes, it's considered a vote of no confidence in the government. The cabinet is constitutionally expected to resign.
Wow. So very high stakes indeed. Even though the guillotine exists, cut motions offer this powerful, though admittedly rarely successful, countermeasure for MPs to register dissent.
Exactly. It's a potent tool, even if its passage is rare.
Okay, so after these votes and potential cut motions, what are the final legislative steps needed to make the budget actual law and allow the government to finally start spending the money?
Right. Once all the demands for grants are passed, either individually or via the guillotine, they're all consolidated into a single bill called the Appropriation Bill.
The Appropriation Bill, okay.
This bill explicitly authorizes the government to withdraw the specified amounts of money from the main government account, the Consolidated Fund of India. Article 114, Clause 3, specifically states that no money can be withdrawn without this kind of parliamentary enactment. It's the legal key to the Treasury.
Got it. And what about taxes? Where do changes to tax rates get formalized?
That happens through the Finance Bill. This is usually introduced alongside the budget speech itself, and it details all the government's proposals for changes in existing tax rates or the imposition of new taxes for the upcoming financial year.
And the finance bill is typically what's called a money bill, which has specific implications for the upper house, the Rajya Sabha, correct?
That's right. As a money bill, it primarily requires the approval of the Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha can discuss it and suggest amendments, but the Lok Sabha isn't obligated to accept them. Its role is mainly recommendatory when it comes to money bills.
Okay.
Now, what's been a point of, let's say, some contention in recent years is that sometimes finance bills have controversially included provisions that aren't strictly related to taxes or government expenditure.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the 2016 Finance Bill included amendments to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which governs foreign funding for NGOs. And the 2017 bill actually changed the structure and composition of about 19 different quasi-judicial bodies or tribunals.
Wow. So non-financial matters tucked into a finance bill. Why is that controversial?
Because critics argue it bypasses the potentially more rigorous legislative scrutiny, including review by the Rajya Sabha, that these non-financial provisions might otherwise receive if introduced as separate ordinary bills. It raises questions about proper legislative procedure.
That's quite a way to potentially push through unrelated items. Okay, another scenario. What if the government needs more money later in the year, say, for an unforeseen emergency or a new program after the main budget has already passed and the financial year is underway?
Good question. If the government needs additional funds for expenditure that wasn't originally approved in the budget, it has to come back to Parliament and introduce what are called supplementary demands for grants.
Okay, so they have to ask again.
Yes, but here's a really significant detail. Remarkably, these supplementary demands, which can sometimes involve very large sums of money, have historically never undergone the same kind of detailed scrutiny by the standing committees that the main budget demands do.
Never. So they just get debated and voted on in the main house.
Generally, yes. For example, in 2018-19, something like 3 lakh crore rupees, which was about 12% of the entire original budget estimate, was authorized through these supplementary demands later in the year. This included things like a big equity infusion for the airline Air India.
12% extra authorized without that committee deep dive. That does sound like a potential gap in oversight, doesn't it?
It's certainly something parliamentary observers point to as an area where scrutiny could potentially be strengthened. It shows how significant amounts of funds can be authorized without the same level of detailed oversight applied to the main budget proposals.
That's a crucial point about accountability. So it's clear parliamentary oversight doesn't just stop once the budget is passed. There's also scrutiny of how the money was actually spent after the fact.
Oh, absolutely. That post-spending oversight is vital.
Hmm.
And two key parliamentary committees play crucial roles here. The first is the Public Accounts Committee, or PAY.
The pay, what do?
They examine the audit reports prepared by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, the CAG. And the CAG produces a lot of reports, often over 40 every year, covering different government departments and schemes.
Right.
The PAY takes these CAG reports and scrutinizes whether the money was spent legally, efficiently, and for the purpose it was sanctioned for. They look for waste, mismanagement, irregularities.
Can you give an example of what they might find?
Sure. A revealing case was the Pechan 134th report, which looked into a major health infrastructure scheme, the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana, PMSSY.
What did they find there?
They highlighted some pretty systemic issues, things like the absence of clear operational guidelines for the scheme, a lack of mechanisms to properly monitor expenditure, which led to large amounts of funds remaining unspent, and even a 5-year delay in completing several new AIMS hospital projects due to poor contract management.
5 years delay, wow.
Yeah. And they even noted the estimated capital costs for these new AIMS institutes shot up dramatically after just 4 years, from an initial estimate of around Rs 332 crore per institute to about Rs 820 crore.
That's a massive cost escalation. So these PAIC reports, based on CAG audits, offer invaluable lessons for improving governance and preventing recurrence.
Exactly. They provide crucial accountability on actual spending and can uncover deep-seated systemic flaws.
Okay, so that's the PECS Act focusing on the audit trail. What about the other committee you mentioned, the Estimates Committee? What's its primary focus, especially now that standing committees look at the initial budget estimates?
Right. While the standing committees now do the primary examination of the proposed estimates in the budget, the Estimates Committee has evolved its role. It tends to focus more broadly on examining how government organizations are working in terms of administrative efficiency, suggesting reforms, checking if policies are aligned with the estimates, and looking at potential economies.
So more about efficiency and organization.
Kind of. They might examine, for instance, the structure of a public sector undertaking or the implementation mechanisms of a particular policy area.
Any key findings from them?
Yes, another important example comes from their 29th report, which looked at defense production and procurement.
Defense spending, always a critical area.
Absolutely. And the committee observed that defense expenditure back in 2016-17 was actually at a historical low as a percentage of GDP, about 1.6%, which they noted was the lowest since the conflict year of 1962.
Lowest since 62, that's significant.
It is. And they also noted that a continuously declining capital procurement budget within that defense spending was adversely impacting the modernization of the armed forces. They pointed to the urgent need to replace aging, obsolete armaments. So these findings directly link budget allocation levels to critical national capabilities and preparedness.
These committee reports really paint a detailed, often critical picture of the challenges and areas needing improvement across government. They offer this essential lens on how things are actually functioning. Now, for you, our listener, all these numbers, committees, reports, it can be a bit overwhelming, I get it. Let's try to demystify some of the key financial terms that always crop up in budget documents, starting with how the numbers themselves are often labeled. We hear about budget estimates, revised estimates, and actuals. What's the difference there?
That's a good question because you see them all the time.
Oh.
Okay, so budget estimates, or BE, refer to the figures projected for the upcoming financial year. That's the plan.
The plan for next year.
Okay. Then you have revised estimates, RE. These are for the current financial year, the year we're in when the budget is presented. They incorporate any changes or revisions that have happened since the initial budget for this current year was presented 12 months ago. So it's an updated forecast for the current year.
An update based on reality so far.
Exactly. And finally, you have actuals. These are the final audited figures for the previous financial year, so the year that has just ended. These often differ somewhat from both the initial budget estimates and the later revised estimates for that year, providing the final look at what truly transpired financially.
Okay, so BE for next year, RE for this year, actuals for last year. That helps clarify the timeline of the numbers. Now let's talk deficits, because those are always front page news. They often sound like a big problem. What exactly is the fiscal deficit? Everyone talks about it.
Right, the fiscal deficit. It's probably the most commonly cited figure. Essentially, it's the gap between the government's total expenditure everything it spends and its total receipts, excluding what it borrows.
Excluding borrowings. Okay.
Yeah. So it represents how much the government actually needs to borrow in a given year to meet all its expenses. For example, back in 2018-19, India's fiscal deficit was estimated at about 3.4% of its GDP. It's often seen as the most comprehensive indicator of the government's overall financial health and its borrowing requirements for the year.
So it's about the total new borrowing needed for that year. What about revenue deficit? That sounds like maybe a more specific type of borrowing is involved.
It is. The revenue deficit occurs specifically when the government's revenue expenditure, remember, the day-to-day running costs like salaries, subsidies, interest, exceeds its revenue receipts, taxes, and non-tax revenue.
So spending more on running costs than you're bringing in from regular income.
Exactly. It means the government is essentially borrowing money just to cover its ongoing operational expenses, not necessarily for creating long-term assets. This is often viewed as less desirable, fiscally speaking, because these borrowings don't directly generate future productive capacity to help pay them back. In 2018-19, about 2.2% of GDP was estimated as the revenue deficit.
Okay, borrowing for daily expenses versus borrowing for investment. And then there's primary deficit. That sounds like an even more refined measure, maybe stripping out some of the historical burden.
That's exactly what it does. The primary deficit is simply the fiscal deficit, minus the interest payments the government has to make on its borrowings from previous years.
Okay, so take the total borrowing need, subtract the interest payments on old debt.
And what's left shows you how much the government is borrowing just for its current year's programs and expenses, excluding the cost of servicing that inherited debt load. It gives a clearer picture, some argue, of the government's current fiscal stance and whether its current policies are adding to the debt burden, independent of past decisions.
That makes sense. And then, of course, there's the cumulative impact of all these yearly deficits and borrowings over time, outstanding debt. That's the big overall picture of what the country owes, right?
Precisely. Outstanding debt is the total accumulated stock of money borrowed by successive governments over many years that still needs to be repaid. In 2018-19, for example, the central government's outstanding debt was estimated at around 48.8% of GDP.
Almost half the size of the economy. That sounds like a lot. Is there a mechanism to control this?
Yes, absolutely. To manage this and try to ensure long-term financial discipline, India enacted the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, 2003, commonly known as the FRBM Act.
The FRBM Act, what did that aim to do?
Its main initial goal was to mandate gradual reductions in the government's deficits. It originally targeted reducing the fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP by 2007-08, although that deadline has been extended multiple times over the years. The 2018 amendment to the Act, for instance, pushed the 3% target to 2020-21.
So the targets have shifted.
Yes, and notably the FRBM Act also at one point removed the specific target for eliminating the revenue deficit, shifting the primary focus more towards the overall fiscal deficit and debt levels.
I remember there was a committee, the N.K. Singh Committee, that reviewed the FRBM Act a few years ago too, right? What were their key recommendations? Did they suggest changes?
Yes, they did. The N.K. Singh Committee, reporting in 2017, actually proposed replacing the existing FRBM Act with a new Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Bill.
A new bill. What were the main ideas?
They recommended using the total government debt to GDP ratio as the primary anchor for fiscal policy in the long run. They suggested aiming for a central government debt level of 38.7% of GDP, and alongside that, a fiscal deficit of 2.5% of GDP, both by the financial year 2022-23.
So more emphasis on the overall debt stock.
Yes, and specific gradual glide paths to get there. They also made another significant recommendation, establishing an independent, autonomous fiscal council.
A fiscal council, what would that do?
The idea was for this council to provide independent, multi-year fiscal forecasts, assess the government's fiscal performance against its targets, and generally advise the government on fiscal matters, aiming to bring greater transparency and institutional credibility to the whole process.
Interesting idea. So stepping back, why do these deficits and debt levels matter so much to the broader economy? Why is everyone, economists, markets, media, always talking about them? What are the real-world implications if they get too high?
Well, deficit financing the government spending more than it earns and borrowing the difference can sometimes be necessary, especially maybe during an economic downturn to stimulate demand. But if deficits are consistently high,
yes,
it can lead to problems. One major risk is inflation. If the government pumps a lot of borrowed money into the economy without a corresponding increase in the production of goods and services, it can push prices up.
Okay, inflation risk. What else?
High deficits mean more government borrowing. This borrowing competes with private companies who also want to borrow money to invest. This can potentially drive up interest rates for everyone, making investment more expensive and potentially slowing down economic growth. This is sometimes called the crowding out effect.
Crowding out private investment.
Potentially.
Yes.
And perhaps most significantly, as we touched on earlier, higher deficits lead to a larger stock of debt, which means bigger interest payments year after year. These interest payments become a large, unavoidable, committed expenditure in the budget.
Right. Taking away funds from other things.
Exactly. It takes away fiscal space money that could otherwise be used for crucial development projects, investing in education or healthcare, building infrastructure, or even cutting taxes. So managing deficits and debt is this constant balancing act for governments, trading off short-term needs against long-term fiscal health.
It really all comes back to impact, doesn't it? Beyond the complex numbers, beyond the parliamentary debates and committees, why is the union budget so fundamentally important to everyday life in India? What's the big picture significance?
It's truly a cornerstone for national resource allocation. It's the primary mechanism through which the government distributes funds to priority sectors, be it agriculture, defense, health, education, and tries to address critical national challenges.
So it directs the money.
Yes. And through that, it fuels development and economic growth. Budget spending creates jobs, it can foster innovation, it can encourage savings and investments across the economy through various schemes and tax policies.
And what about inclusion?
It's also crucial for financial and social inclusion. The budget provides the necessary financial support for massive programs that directly impact millions of lives. Things like the Kisan Credit Card Scheme for farmers or the Ayushman Bharat health insurance scheme. The funding for these comes through the budget. And then, looking outwards, the budget also reflects India's economic vision and policy direction to the rest of the world. It significantly influences foreign investment decisions, trade relations, and the country's overall standing in the global economy.
So its statement both domestically and internationally, it truly is this comprehensive national document. And speaking of the word budget, you mentioned it wasn't in the Constitution, but the word itself has a cool origin story, right? I think I heard it's not even originally English.
That's right. It does have a neat origin. The term budget actually comes from an old French word, bougette.
Bougette.
Yeah, B-O-U-G-E-T-T-E. It meant a small leather bag or wallet.
A little bag, like carrying your money.
Exactly. Or, historically, perhaps the bag used by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain to carry the papers outlining the fiscal plans to Parliament. So the container gave its name to the contents. A nice little historical detail for you.
That's charming. I like that. Okay, and just to wrap up our terminology tour, can you quickly explain the key government funds where all this money is actually held, and also the difference between charged and voted expenditure? Those sound like important technical distinctions in the process.
Certainly. There are three key government accounts or funds you should know about. First, and most important, is the Consolidated Fund of India. This is established under Article 266 of the Constitution.
Okay.
Essentially, all government revenues, taxes, non-tax revenues, plus all loans raised by the government and any money it receives back from loans it gave out, all go into a single consolidated fund. And critically, no money can be withdrawn from this fund except under an appropriation passed by Parliament.
So that's the main pot, under strict parliamentary control. What are the others?
Then there's the Contingency Fund of India, set up under Article 267. This is a much smaller fund, like an imprest account. It holds a fixed amount of money. The corpus is currently Rs 500 crore, placed at the disposal of the president.
For what purpose?
To meet urgent, unforeseen expenditures, like maybe disaster relief when Parliament isn't in session or before it can approve the spending. Any money taken out needs to be authorized by Parliament later, and the fund is then replenished back to its fixed level.
Like an emergency float.
Exactly. And the third one is the Public Account of India, also mentioned under Article 266. This account holds money where the government is acting more like a banker rather than holding its own revenue.
Like what kind of money?
Things like provident fund collections from employees, small savings scheme deposits, and other similar funds, where the money doesn't technically belong to the government but is just held by it in trust. Because it's public money in that sense, parliamentary authorization isn't required for making payments out of a public account.
Ah, okay. Consolidated fund needs approval, public account doesn't, contingency is for emergencies. Got it. And finally, charged versus voted expenditure. Is that about how Parliament handles different types of spending from the Consolidated Fund?
Precisely. It relates to spending from the Consolidated Fund. Some specific expenditures are designated by the Constitution as being charged upon the Consolidated Fund of India,
Charged, meaning
meaning they have to be paid, but Parliament doesn't vote on them, although it can discuss them. This is done to ensure the independence and stability of certain key constitutional offices and obligations.
examples.
Things like the salary and allowances of the President, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, salaries of Supreme Court and High Court judges, the Comptroller and Auditor General salary, and crucially, the government's debt servicing charges, interest payments, and loan repayments. These are charged.
So they're non-votable, ensuring payment regardless of political
Yep,
wins.
that's the principle. All other expenditure from the Consolidated Fund falls under the category of voted expenditure. This means it must be presented to the Lok Sabha in the form of demands for grants and requires the specific approval of the vote of the Lok Sabha to be withdrawn and spent. This gives Parliament direct control over the vast majority of government spending.
That's fascinating. So many layers to this whole process, aren't there? From the initial constitutional mandate in Article 112 through the revenue and capital budgets, the complex preparation, the detailed parliamentary oversight mechanisms committees, voting, cut motions, the different funds, and these distinctions like charged versus voted. It truly is a complex, living document and process that shapes the nation.
It really is.
And for anyone listening who's now intrigued and wants to dive even deeper into the actual budget documents themselves, where can they find them?
It's actually very easy nowadays. All the union budget documents are made publicly available online, usually on the day the budget is presented. The official website is generally indiabudget.gov.in.
indiabudget.gov.in.
And there you'll find everything. The complete budget speech, a really useful summary document called Budget at a Glance, the detailed expenditure budget volumes, which break down spending by ministry and scheme, the receipts budget showing where the money comes from, the finance bill, all the statements mandated under the FRBM Act, and much more.
So it's all there for you, our listener, to explore if you want to get into the real nitty-gritty. Offers a wealth of information to truly become well-informed.
Absolutely. Transparency is key.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've navigated the intricate world of India's union budget, right from its constitutional bedrock in Article 112 through its granular details of revenue and capital, its journey through Parliament,
The oversight from committees like the PayPC and estimates.
and demystified terms like fiscal deficit and charged expenditure. It's clear that this annual financial statement is so much more than just a collection of numbers on a page.
It's absolutely true. It's a dynamic instrument of governance, isn't it? Constantly trying to balance the nation's immediate needs with its long-term financial realities and, its broader developmental vision. It really serves as a testament to the complex machinery, the constitutional design, the parliamentary processes, the administrative effort that keeps a vast democracy like India moving forward. It reflects its aspirations and, let's be honest, addresses its challenges in a very tangible financial way every single year.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Considering how central the budget process is to steering a country's direction, what aspects of your own country's national financial planning, its budget process, will you want to put under the microscope? And what might a really deep dive into those figures and processes reveal about its true priorities?